As you know, we will be having the 13th session of UNCTAD this year. It will be held in Doha, and this building has been ringing with the sound of negotiations about to come. So we have two speakers, Vice Yu of the South Center, because he has been studying the chairman's draft and revised draft. And we have Richard Kozul Wright, who is an official in UNCTAD in charge of South-South cooperation. He has been very involved in following the discussions and also the Secretary General of UNCTAD's report. But most of all, we now have with us the chairman who wrote the draft, that is Ambassador Maruping of Lesotho, who is the chair of the Trade and Development Board, and he is going to preside over the negotiations that will lead to the final outcome document. So before we have our two speakers giving us a brief rundown of their expectations and the analysis of UNCTAD XIII, I would like to recognize and welcome Ambassador Maruping, our president of TDB, to just say a few words. He has come from his very busy schedule. Tomorrow, I think the negotiations will resume. So maybe you can just say a few words to us on what we can expect. Thank you.
President Kapa, Chairman, thank you very much. I have been ambushed, actually. I will say a few words just to brief you, really, that there was a draft that was prepared way back, and we had tried to be innovative by beginning with the background, going into analysis, policy responses, and maybe the role of UNCTAD. But that innovative approach did not particularly enjoy popular support, so we reformatted the text in a way that is more orthodox. Sometimes people feel more comfortable in the familiar than in the unfamiliar ground. So tomorrow we start on that text to look at it. Not that because it has been reformatted that it is the most popular document in town. On the contrary, it is not that popular, but for different reasons, completely diametrically, and that's what creates space for negotiations. It's a negotiating document, and a negotiating document is not supposed to give answers because there are such various views. Surely there are a lot of it, similar views. Some dovetail very well one after the other, but some of them there is divergence, and it is very difficult to reflect everybody's wish in such a situation. And other proposals that had been submitted don't even fall within the mandate of UNCTAD and could not be concluded. But then we shouldn't take the place of the negotiators. It's for the negotiators to shape it up in a way that they would like to see UNCTAD to be doing in the next 4 years. So for me, I think this is the ample opportunity for everyone to make inputs in shaping up the way forward for UNCTAD in the next 4 years, amidst all these challenges that have been so well articulated, both this morning and this afternoon. I'm really mesmerized by the wealth of knowledge, experience, analysis that has been put before us this morning and this afternoon. And it is for UNCTAD really among all other institutions to take this forward and see how it can help member states, particularly developing countries, forward in shaping their policies. So I will stop here, Chair, and say that we are studying the process. And we are more eager for people to contribute rather than to condemn. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, President of Trade and Development Board. I'm very glad you are here, so whatever we say here as inputs will directly go to you. I think there are two major aspects to an outcome document. The first is a reflection of the UNCTAD members on the state of the world, particularly development-led globalization, which is the theme, and what we have discussed this morning and what we'll discuss tomorrow will be very relevant. But the second part may be just as important and perhaps more important, and that is, given this dynamic developments in the world economy and so on, what is the role of UNCTAD? UNCTAD already has a mandate and does not depend on UNCTAD XIII for its role, but UNCTAD XIII could give pointers to UNCTAD for the future, both in terms of the Secretariat's work and the intergovernmental work of UNCTAD. And I think this is the importance, the updating of UNCTAD's work to give pointers and directions and so on. So our two speakers will give us their inputs. We'll start with Richard Kozul Wright, who is a member of the UNCTAD Secretariat. Richard, please.
Martin, thank you, and thank you for the invitation. It's getting late, I guess. I think Groucho Marx famously remarked that time flies like an arrow, fruit flies like a banana. I guess we're more like fruit flies at this late stage of the proceedings. I will try and be brief. I'm going to speak exclusively to the Secretary General's report and to try and give you a flavour of what are the kind of main themes and issues that the Secretary General wanted to raise in that report. This is a tradition in UNCTAD that at the time of the conference, the SG is given the opportunity to flag the kind of main issues and concerns as he sees them that are facing developing countries and that require effective multilateral action and new policy thinking. As such, he's obviously aware that he's speaking to the concerns of the member states as reflected in the themes and the sub-themes that they themselves have chosen for the conference. But he's not bound by those themes and sub-themes, and the report is very much seen as an independent exercise by the head of the organization, an independent voice presenting ideas to the broader development community and not just the member states in UNCTAD. I mean, obviously in that context, there have been huge changes in the global economy since the last conference in Accra in 2008, and in many respects the report is an attempt to come to terms with those changes. The preface is entitled, not accidentally, "A World Turned Upside Down," and in many respects both the idea of a financial crisis that has fundamentally disrupted economic life, and the idea that the South out of that is emerging as a much more potent voice in the global economy, I think is captured to some extent by that phrase of a world turned upside down. More generally, I think we were trying to convey the idea that the current state of the world economy and the situation facing many developing countries is highly unbalanced, not just in the macroeconomic sense of the term, but along a series of axes, whether it's the environmental axis, the links between the financial sector and the real economy, between the economic and social spheres. The current state of the world is dangerously unbalanced, and that trying to address those imbalances cannot be done by returning to a business as usual approach to thinking about the global economy and in particular the challenges facing developing countries. And that, of course, is a fairly comfortable position for UNCTAD to be in. UNCTAD historically has been a non-conformist institution, and its views of the world have traditionally challenged conventional thinking. And this is a moment when non-conformist and unconventional thinking should have its day, and we hope that those are the values that are reflected in this document. We quote in the opening preface. I'm not sure if it's politically correct to do so now, but we quote in the preface Dominique Strauss-Kahn, who in 2008, in happier times for him, noted that the events since 2000 and the crisis that hit Lehman's have devastated the intellectual foundations of the global economic order of the last 25 years. And for us, that global economic order is characterized by what we call finance-driven globalization. And we spend some time in the report trying to set out what we understand by finance-driven globalization. It's obviously much of the things that have been talked about in the meeting today. It's the idea of financial deregulation, opening of the capital account, the rapid rise of international capital flows as being the dominant feature of international economic transactions. But beyond that, of course, it's a sense in which financial markets and financial institutions in general have become a lot more influential over the last 25 years in terms of shaping economic performance at all levels, in terms of incentives, in terms of ideology, in terms of institutions. The financialization of economic life has been, for us, the dominant feature of this of the past 25 or 30 years. At the heart of that, and it's worth emphasizing, has been the massive accumulation of private debt. There's a fixation amongst policymakers, particularly in the North right now, on public debt. But the driving feature of the last 25 to 30 years has been the massive accumulation of of private debt. And when you look at the features of that, the mushrooming of financial leveraging, the emergence of a shadow banking system, the proliferation of financial innovation and products, so-called securitization, it's around the growth of private debt that those features have essentially grown. In the process, we argue, and again, it's a position that UNCTAD, as Rubens Recupero noted this morning, has been worrying about for some quite considerable time. In the process, finance, it seems to us, has become the master rather than the servant of economic life. The traditional role of finance, of protecting savings and acting as a catalyst and support for productive investment, have given way to a whole range of other activities that ultimately have not been productive in terms of overall economic performance. Finally, I think another feature that we insist on in the report when it comes to finance-driven globalization, and I guess we quote in the first footnote of this report Tony Blair to the effect that it's a reminder that it's a political project. There's a sense often that globalization is somehow a natural and inevitable feature of economic life. It's nothing of the kind. It is fundamentally a political project. It's driven by politics. It's guided by policy choices. And as such, it is and should be open to discussion and debate rather than taken as a fait accompli, as if you read the Blair quote in the first footnote, a lot of the political and business class of the last 20 years has tried to give the impression that it really is simply a fait accompli, and either you are with us or against us, to borrow a phrase from a like-minded politician. Obviously, for UNCTAD, there's a lot of discussion now about the implications of finance-driven globalization, particularly for advanced countries. For UNCTAD, the question really is the implications of finance-driven globalization for development thinking and development outcomes. We do insist, I think, in this context, that finance and financialization has actually been a much more important and potent force than trade liberalization over the course of this period of time. Juan Somavia noted earlier this morning that financial liberalization and trade liberalization have been the driving forces of globalization over this period. But we do insist that financial liberalization has been a much more potent force. Economists naturally gravitate towards the trade story because we have a robust intellectual framework which tells us why trade liberalization is a win-win outcome, although it's not necessarily a framework that many of us would adhere to here, but it's a very potent part of the economic intellectual tradition. But in terms of the real driving force, and both intellectually and in terms of outcomes, it has been finance that has been in charge of the processes that impact on development over this period of time. And at the heart of that, I think, and we argue in this report, has been a shift to associating development and development prospects far less with internal driving dynamics and a focus on external integration and external forces. So it's the markets and the resources and the firms that matter from this perspective are not your own firms, but are very much foreign firms, foreign markets, foreign resources, foreign firms, as the kind of carriers of catch-up growth and economic convergence. And that switch from the internal to the external, I think, has been a very prevalent feature of development thinking and policy making over this period in which finance-driven globalization has been dominant. The outcomes of that in terms of performance has to be treated carefully, I guess, as the discussion this morning clearly indicated. We argue that this has fundamentally been a period of interrupted development, with a particular focus on the period 1980 to 2000. So when we look at the figures, as was discussed this morning, when you look at investment figures, when you look at measures of structural transformation, when you look at per capita growth performance, when you look at shocks, vulnerability to shocks and crises, there is little doubt that the period from 80 to 2000 can be fully described as one of interrupted development. The difficulty comes, as the discussion this morning suggested, from the period since 2000, and the question about whether this has been a period in which development has restarted rather than been interrupted. And I guess, like many of the speakers this morning, in the report we argued for a qualified yes in answer to that question, and for much the same reasons that were discussed this morning. The growing global imbalances that emerged over this period, it turned out, worked very much in favor of the South and development prospects. This also gave rise to an interesting feature in which the Washington Consensus became a less dominant influence in terms of shaping policy. The argument that there was some easing up of policy space and thinking about alternatives contributed to a revival of development prospects in some countries. And there was a willingness to look at, in a sense, old mechanisms and solutions that had somewhat gone out of fashion during the period of structural adjustment. Regional solutions, for example, have become much more fashionable over the course of the last decade than the preceding 2 decades. The point, I guess, where we would agree, and the report argues, I would very much agree with the speakers this morning, is that many of these favorable circumstances have been somewhat ad hoc and fortuitous, and therefore they are probably not sustainable for the reasons that were spelled out this morning, and we spell out to some extent in the report. It's also the case, I think I would add, that even during this period it would be difficult to argue that the outcomes were any more inclusive over the last decade than the preceding decades. Inequality, although as Alfredo noted there are exceptions, inequality has remained a stubborn feature of the economic environment in both developed and developing countries over the course of the last couple of decades, and including the last decade. So that's our kind of reading of the what we call finance-driven globalization. It draws very heavily on the UNCTAD tradition, not surprisingly, and I hope reflects many of the viewpoints that were aired so far in this meeting. The second part of the report argues for a shift to what we call development-centered globalization as the alternative to finance-driven globalization. I guess it's a concept in progress rather than being a fully flashed out idea. It's intended, I think, to some extent, to get away from associating development with the poverty agenda, which I think has been a feature of development thinking over the course of the last 2 or 3 decades. Development has become associated very closely with poverty alleviation and dealing with deprivation. That's not really the way in which UNCTAD looks at that. At the problem. We are much more interested in focusing on structural transformation in the way that Charles was talking about himself earlier today, looking at the kind of constraints that can reduce growth prospects, and looking at the kinds of linkages that need to be strengthened to ensure the kind of virtuous development circles that have traditionally been at the heart of development thinking in a more classical tradition. When it comes to the actual agenda, I guess what that means in practice, and we try and spell out in the report, is that this is a much bigger rebalancing agenda than has so far been discussed by the international development community. And we have to think of rebalancing as a much more comprehensive challenge than has so far been the case. That includes the rebalancing between finance and the real economy. It includes the rebalancing between the carbon economy and the high carbon economy and the low carbon economy. It involves the rebalancing between the economic and the social spheres of life and livelihoods. In terms of the elements that we insist as being central to that agenda, it's a familiar agenda, and it's one that, again, has been discussed, I think, this morning. It's a strong focus on productive investment as being critical to any sort of sustainable and inclusive outcomes. It's a pro-industry, a pro-industrial focus, structural transformation in general, but pro-industry in particular. I think what it has to do, in a way that some traditional development strategies have failed to do, is to move beyond focusing exclusively on economic growth and linking the growth agenda to issues of employment and redistribution in the way that Juan Somavia talked about this morning, and that we try and spell out a little bit in this report. That comfortably takes us into some familiar UNCTAD territory. We obviously insist constantly on the importance of policy space as being central to any sort of development agenda that is capable of pushing a more inclusive and sustainable development process. There's an underlying issue with policy space about whether the problem is one of underutilization of what is there already, or whether in fact there has been a reduction of policy space which makes it difficult for countries to forge the kind of alternatives that we're talking about. I guess in this report we focus on the underutilization of existing policy space, and in that context put a strong emphasis on the importance of countries thinking about developing what we call, following a fairly lengthy literature, the important role of the developmental state in ensuring the kinds of integrated framework that is necessary to develop these kinds of alternative agendas. I think we insist very strongly in this report that the focus on the developmental state and what it needs to do provides a healthy alternative to the good governance discussion, which has tended to be pervasive when it comes to thinking about institutions in the developing world, but ultimately for us does not provide a useful framework for looking at the institutional challenges, particularly those facing the state in most developing countries. Needless to say, and let me finish with that, the focus on development strategy, on mobilizing domestic resources, on industrial policy, on the links between economic and social policy, whilst important, cannot be exhaustive from an UNCTAD perspective. UNCTAD was set up to look at the development challenge from a global perspective, and it's the global challenges and constraints that ultimately make this institution what it is. And in that context, we argue very strongly in this report that a global New Deal is what is required if development-centered globalization is actually to move from the drawing board to something that is more practical and realizable. We choose our historical analogies carefully. The New Deal obviously has strong historical connotations with what happened in the 1930s, particularly in the advanced countries. It's good to remember what that was. The heart of the New Deal in the 30s was a strategy of reflation, regulation, and redistribution, and all those features need now to be central to a global New Deal. It's often forgotten that the old New Deal, the American New Deal, was also a developmental strategy. Most people forget that the heart of the New Deal in the 1930s was the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was an attempt to industrialize the South of America, and did so very successfully, it has to be said. And so the developmental component of the New Deal, which is often forgotten in recreating that history, needs to be imported into any sort of discussion of a global New Deal as that takes shape in the 21st century for reshaping the global economy. The elements of that global New Deal are spelt out at some length in this report. It involves rethinking finance in the way that Yilma's discussed extensively this morning, and there are many features of that, both multilateral, regional, and national. It involves refashioning the trade and investment system to allow for a much more strategic kind of integration of developing countries into the global economy, which we think is missing from the current international rules that deal with trade and investment, and it involves certainly a rethinking and a boosting of the development cooperation agenda, including bringing in new elements such as South-South cooperation. In all of that agenda, and I'll finish on this point because I think it probably segues nicely into Vice's presentation. At the center of this challenge is a recognition that the multilateral agenda over the last 2 or 3 decades has suffered from a very significant deficit of trust, particularly trust between the developing countries and the developed countries. And without a rebuilding of that trust, it will be very difficult to establish appropriate multilateral solutions. That means that the governance of the international financial and trade architecture has to be fully on the table when it comes to thinking about development-centered globalization. And I think that is a particular point of contestation when it comes to the discussions around UNCTAD XIII, but at least from the point of view of the Secretariat, a discussion of global governance of in trade, finance and investment has to be prominent when it comes to fashioning alternative development strategies that can rebalance the inequities that have emerged in the global economy over the last 2 to 3 decades. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard. I think from what you say that there used to be a concept of development and developing countries pursuing development strategies. This was hijacked by globalization driven by finance rather than the real economy, and by structural adjustment that taught developing countries that development means what foreign revenue, finance, and foreign companies can do for you rather than what you can do for yourself. Now, this has unraveled because of the crisis in globalization, the questioning over finance, and the search for solutions, including back to development strategies, perhaps in a modern way. But in this critical juncture, multilateralism faces a crisis because of the lack of trust north and south. He didn't say what the specific roles of UNCTAD should be. Maybe that is not for the Secretariat to say, but the member states. The latest situation in the negotiations is that there was a zero draft put forward by Ambassador Maruping as president of the Trade and Development Board. That has been altered, as he said, into a zero draft Ref 1. I don't know the exact number of that document. And I think this is what my colleague Vice is going to address. It's a South Center look at the negotiating draft. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. I'll be brief. Actually, it's already 5 minutes to 5:30, so we'll try to be brief. As far as we understand it, in terms of the negotiating process for UNCTAD XIII, Rev 1 text has come out, prepared by Ambassador Maruping, and the parties are supposed to start negotiating it tomorrow. And it seems that the issue really is one in terms of what the vision is for the members of UNCTAD over what UNCTAD should be. For the past decade or so, developed countries essentially have started thinking of UNCTAD more as a technical assistance organization, and this comes out. This came out in the position papers, for example, of JUSCANs, Japan, US, Switzerland, Canada, New Zealand, others, the European Union, and the Eastern Europeans. But I think for developing countries, UNCTAD is more than a technical assistance organization. It was the organization that provided the G77 with intellectual support in the 60s and 70s. It was the organization that helped shape much of the development discourse for developing countries. And so I guess for developing countries, especially in the G77, this is a strategic issue. And this is what has come out, and it was echoed and reflected in some ways in the G77's position paper that was submitted as part of inputs to Ambassador Maruping for the Zero Draft in October last year. This came out in the African Group position paper and the LDC Group position paper as well. So you have two diametrically opposed concepts, I guess, of what UNCTAD should be. And UNCTAD XIII is part of that series of UNCTAD conferences that reflects that struggle. Whether UNCTAD gets shoehorned into the paradigm that is represented by the World Bank, by the IMF, by the OECD in terms of the kinds of policies, the kinds of issues, and the kind of assistance that would be provided to developing countries, or whether UNCTAD should be more than that, whether UNCTAD should be the one that would provide us developing countries with intellectual input. So for UNCTAD XIII, the strategic objective really is to, for developing countries, really is to be the demanders again, for UNCTAD to stand up on its feet and be the one to provide them with critical strategic policy analysis and technical support, and move UNCTAD away from the technical assistance institution that developed countries want it to be. So in terms of the context of UNCTAD XIII, more and more, I think, within the G77, they're actually still negotiating right now in the other room over the Rev 1 text. And from what we hear from colleagues in the missions here and from discussions with many of them over the Rev 1 document, the issue is whether to take a broad and strategic look at the Rev 1 document and see what kind of outcome document it will be, or whether to go in depth into the document and try to push in your issues in there. And I think that is something that is an existential issue for the G77 right now, because within the subgroups of the G77, there are groups in it that want to put in their pet issues, and there are groups within the G77 that say, let's take a step back, let's look at it strategically and view UNCTAD XIII as a way in which we can give UNCTAD a shot in the arm as far as it being a strategic policy development institution is concerned. Martin mentioned something about perhaps UNCTAD XIII being the conference that would try to identify or provide guidance in terms of the key issues that UNCTAD Secretariat should be going for. And if we were to reflect on the discussions that took place this morning and in this afternoon, then it seems pretty clear that at least in terms of the key policy areas that UNCTAD, that both developing countries and could push for UNCTAD, those are essentially three areas. One is the short-term and medium-term policy response to the global financial crisis and the possible double-dip recession, which might mean, therefore, that UNCTAD really has to go back to its roots and focus more on the macroeconomic policy issues that it was really the master at over the past decades. Which might mean, therefore, UNCTAD shifting focus away from some of the more ancillary issues that it had been saddled with over the past UNCTAD conferences, like investment promotion, like competition policy, like trade facilitation, into zeroing back into finance policy, macroeconomic development strategies, the debt issue, and commodities. But UNCTAD also has to be a forward-looking organization, and that might mean that it has to also, as part of the outcome for UNCTAD XIII, look at how UNCTAD could position itself in terms of being the development policy institution that contributes towards the more appropriate policy responses to other crises that are coming down the road or actually hitting developing countries now, like climate change, like food security. Not in the sense of UNCTAD providing the solutions, perhaps, but UNCTAD providing the development perspective that could help shape what the global solutions to this crisis could be. And the third area where UNCTAD XIII could best fit, perhaps, in terms of what developing countries could demand UNCTAD to be is in the area of international cooperation, in the area of international rulemaking, vis-a-vis trade and economic and finance policy. Perhaps in terms of jump-starting intergovernmental discussions on some of these issues, and then eventually transporting that to other forums like in the United Nations General Assembly or in ECOSOC, especially in light of the upcoming discussions that are going to be taking place on Rio+20, and then going towards 2015, what will happen with the MDGs, for example, what kind of development strategies would be moving forward. So perhaps in terms of the strategic objectives, that could be what developing countries should look forward. And I guess for the South Center, that is perhaps what we could be aiming for. So just to conclude, Chair, the key issue really for developing countries is to take back UNCTAD. I guess for far too long, over perhaps the past 5 UNCTAD conferences, UNCTAD's ability to be the critical and strategic and forward-thinking development institution has been hammered back and back by developed countries because they kept on insisting that UNCTAD should focus more and more on being a technical assistance institution. And perhaps this is now the opportunity for developing countries to take back their institution. We must not forget that UNCTAD and the G77 were created at the same time. They're in fact sister organizations. And UNCTAD XIII could be the time and the place in which that could be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have heard from 3 speakers. This is a hot topic for Geneva, at least for the next few months. We've heard that the negotiations are taking place in some room, but I don't think so since Ambassador Maruping is with us. He has said that it will take place
G77
tomorrow. It's the G77 that is having its own meeting on what to say tomorrow. And then here in this room, we are also debating this issue. It's very good that the South Center Conference also has been addressing this. So I open the floor for any questions, comments, and so on. Please. Yes, please. DRC.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I would like to add a small comment on what Mr. Yu has said. The third point of international operations of the UNCTAD. I think in order to take back the UNCTAD, we must avoid duplication. I mean, clarify the role or redefine UNCTAD against other organizations like the IMF, like the ECOSOC, you mentioned that, or the WTO and some other, because it's becoming a bit confusing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other comments? I see a number of NGOs here that have also been engaged in UNCTAD XIII, who might want to say something. Yes, please, Charles.
Mine is just, mine is just to commend Richard and his colleagues at UNCTAD, and all those of you who were involved in the work of UNCTAD, at least for his consistency in remaining a voice, you know, in drawing our attention that all that glitters is not gold. I think, if I may, that's really something we need to constantly underscore, and to pat those of you who are doing this job on the back, because quite frankly, as I listen to Richard again and knowing what the fight on the other side with the heterodox framework has been all about, and increasingly what you see as a disjuncture between what is being discussed in those kind of forums and what actually goes on in the policy-making panels, where the decisions are made. There are walls apart, I'm afraid to say. Because when we talk about financialization and write about it, fantastic. The truth of the matter is that, as Financial Times writes it, I think it's almost their slogan, we live in financial times. You know, that's the advertisement jingle for we live in financial times. It really summarizes it, that the world as we are, for good or for evil, that's what it is. How do you roll that back? Unfortunately, in fact, at the beginning of the 2008-2009 crisis, when people were screaming headlines, the end of capitalism, the end of neo-days, and blah, blah, blah. I gave a lecture at one university that I was still in office, where my conjecture was that this will be one of those winds that will come and go. But in the end, despite all this hullabaloo of G20, G this and G this, as if we're now about to create a new world, nothing will change. There would at most be cosmetic, one or two cosmetic changes in the way things go. And we'll go back to, even with greater vigor, in pursuit of the trend that is going. And it's in that light that I truly, I admire the work of UNCTAD and many institutions that are involved in this, Joe Stiglitz and the teams, involved in constantly reminding the world that it's not a one-size shoe that should fit all. Please keep that on. At least if somebody gets confused, you have to grab one on that report or the other for some clarity. But unfortunately, the river seems to be flowing so massively on the other side that but don't be discouraged. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments? Otherwise, I'll ask Vice or Richard if they would like to briefly respond.
I'll just take a stab at it. Yes, it's true, sir, from DRC that we must avoid duplication. But at the same time, I think if one reads the position papers of the US and the European Union on what UNCTAD should be doing, they said that UNCTAD's work has to be linked to what the World Bank and the IMF and the OECD. I think there are specific sections in there. And I think that betrays a certain sense of what these partners would like UNCTAD to be. And I think that essentially is for UNCTAD as an institution to be part of the orthodoxy rather than be pushing for heterodox policies. So perhaps the non-duplication comes in perhaps in terms of some of the activities that UNCTAD has to do. But I think in terms of the niche that UNCTAD has and the value that it has for us, that's precisely what Dr. Suludo pointed out. We need to have an institution within the UN system that provides heterodox ideas, because otherwise everything will be orthodox. And when the crisis comes, we won't have an alternative thing to look forward to.
Yeah, I mean, UNCTAD has always had a very broad mandate, which means we always cross into so-called other people's territories, and which Group B likes then to say we shouldn't be in. I mean, the integrated treatment of trade and development and the related issues of finance, investment and technology essentially is the mandate. Now that's always been a very broad mandate, by definition, I think, and developed countries have since 1964 been trying to prune that back and to try and get us to look at these issues from a much narrower perspective. I think if we do that, we will lose precisely what it is that's valuable about UNCTAD, which is this ability to look at a range of issues from a more holistic and integrated development perspective. I think it's very important that developing countries insist on that independence for the Secretariat to kind of pursue that more integrated approach to development policy issues. I think that's very important. Charles, in terms of Charles, is all that glitters. I'm not sure if it was a compliment or a criticism. I have to work that out at some point.
It's a compliment.
I guess, you know, in very different times, Bertolt Brecht, commenting on the situation in equally difficult times, famously said, because the way things are the way they are, things won't stay the way they are. And I guess that's a line that rings true to me. And I actually think that lots of things, I mean, I have been surprised how business as usual has actually come back, surprisingly, over the course of the last 2 years, 2 years since, or 3 years since the crisis. But there is a whole discussion that has opened up over that time, which was essentially beyond the pale before 2008. I mean, if you saw the latest issue of The Economist on state capitalism, for example, then the whole issue of the role of the state, of industrial policy, and now they're being forced to discuss these issues, partly because they look at countries like China and to some extent Brazil and some of the other emerging economies, and they're not doing things, the kind of pen is dropped in the sense that they're not doing things in the way they should be doing according to their conventional view of the world. And so they're being forced to look at these experiences and draw, I mean, they draw the same conclusions that they've always drawn, ironically, but they're forced to look at these in a different way. Discussions of capital controls. I mean, you know, Oliver Blanchard is openly raising this issue of capital controls as being a legitimate part of the policy toolkit for developing countries. Development banks are back in vogue. You know, the role of BNDES in Brazil has captured a lot of attention over the course of the last couple of years. People in South Africa, like Rob Davis, the trade minister, is looking at these and trying to see if there are lessons for a country like South Africa that is trying to move away from trade liberalization as a defining policy to industrial policy and the links between trade and industry, about what role development banks can play in his country. Debt workout mechanisms, which were completely unacceptable to the northern countries 3 years ago, is now back on the agenda because they're all suffering from the problem of sovereign debt crises, and they're looking for solutions which force them into unorthodox thinking, whether they like it or not. And so I mean, I appreciate that, but I'm not convinced that policymakers are quite so firewalled as you perhaps suggest they may be, Charles, although I'll bow to your better experience when it comes to central banks. Thank you.
Thank you for those questions and the concise answers. We have come to the end of the first day. I'm sure you agree with me that a lot of food for thought, and if that is interesting, tomorrow will be fireworks, because we are going to talk about what happened at MC8, for those of you who know what is MC8, and the future of the negotiations this year and after this year for the WTO. But I think Charles and many of you have also raised the issue of the free trade agreements that may be even more urgent in terms of their impact, and perhaps we will also discuss that tomorrow, because that is also part of the trading system, and that issue is especially urgent for African countries and for the LDCs. And in the afternoon, we will discuss the complex outcome of the Durban Conference on Climate Change and what the future of the negotiations are going to be and the future of the climate regime. That is interesting from a negotiating point of view, but even more interesting from the point of view of the future of Earth and humanity. Because as you know, climate change is a serious problem that is going to threaten us physically. We may quarrel whether trade or finance is going to destroy the economic system and what comes out of it. But where the Earth is concerned, if you make a mistake,